Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a live interview with Ambassador David Shinn on the latest Horn Affairs. For comments and concerns, kindly reach out to us via email at tigraipress@gmail.com. Ambassador Shinn, welcome back, and we are happy to see you again.
Thank you, Bishra. I'm glad to be back.
How is the winter treating you?
Well, we have 4 inches of new snow this morning, so we finally have some winter, and first time in 2 years.
Great. We'll jump into the today's agenda. What are the current geopolitical dynamics in the Horn of Africa, particularly regarding the reported collaboration between Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki, Egyptian President Al-Sisi, Djiboutian President Ismail Omar Guelleh, and the Somali Republic President Hassan Sheikh, who allegedly declared collaboration with Al-Shabaab to fight against Ethiopia?
Well, first, I would be very suspicious about any motive based on collaboration with Al-Shabaab. There was a time when Eritrea was, I think, collaborating with Al-Shabaab a number of years ago. The government of Somalia is clearly not interested in supporting Al-Shabaab. In fact, it's opposing it. I'd be a little surprised if Djibouti and Egypt had any interest in dealing with Al-Shabaab one way or the other. But I think what is driving all of this, more importantly, is the relatively recent memorandum of understanding between Ethiopia and Somaliland on a combination of military access for Ethiopia to some 20 kilometers of Gulf of Aden coastline for a lease of 50 years for some kind of military activity there, or military base there, and also access to the port of Berbera in Somaliland in exchange at some time in the future for Ethiopian recognition of Somaliland as an independent state. Now, that has sort of thrown a new wrinkle into Horn of African politics and certainly stirred up Somalia and Mogadishu at a minimum, and caused Somalia to be reaching out for allies in other parts of Northeast Africa, and probably finding some ready allies in Djibouti, Eritrea, and Egypt for their own reasons, not necessarily anything to do with either the recognition of or non-recognition of Somaliland, but just because they have their own concerns about Ethiopia. So you're right, there certainly is more discussion going on among those leaders, which I suspect has been largely organized by Somalia. And that does raise concerns in Ethiopia, but it all began with an agreement or memorandum of understanding involving Somaliland and Ethiopia. Were it not for that MOU, I don't think you'd be having these other contacts going on.
Let me play this.
Somalia has rejected what it called an illegal agreement signed on Monday between its breakaway region of Somaliland and Ethiopia. Following an emergency meeting on Tuesday, the Somali cabinet said the pact has no legal force and would endanger regional stability. Somalia also recalled its ambassador to Ethiopia. The agreement would allow landlocked Ethiopia to use the Red Sea port of Berbera for commercial marine operations. As part of the deal, Somaliland would be recognized as an independent nation in due course, and would also receive a share of state-owned Ethiopian Airlines. Mogadishu has called it a clear violation of the country's sovereignty, and said that Somaliland remains part of Somalia under the Somali constitution. The deal comes only days after Somalia and Somaliland had agreed to restart dialogue, following talks last week mediated by Djibouti. President Hassan Sheikh Mohammed will address Parliament later on Tuesday.
This is what's happening in there. So recently, the Somali president declared that he is collaborating with Al-Shabaab to fight Ethiopia. They actually declared jihad against Ethiopia. Could a jihad war declared against Ethiopia potentially lead to the remaking and reshaping of the Horn of Africa?
Well, if this were actually to happen, I suppose it could. As I indicated, I'm skeptical that is in fact the goal of Hassan Sheikh on the one hand, or Somalia more generally on the other. I just can't imagine what they have to gain by taking that position. I had not heard that particular comment before, and I don't know the context in which it was made, but it's totally contrary to everything that Somalia has been about, at least up until this point in time. I want to go back, though, to one thing about this Ethiopia-Somaliland agreement, which has touched off so many arguments in the Horn of Africa in the last several weeks. And that is to underscore that there's a lot we don't know, those of us on the outside, about the Memorandum of Understanding. To the best of my knowledge, it has not been published. There are some bits and pieces of it slowly leaking out, but I would suggest that we probably know less about what is in it in terms of detail than what a lot of the commentators are saying is in it, or they think is in it. In fact, and I think it's very important that we all step back a little bit and wait until we actually see what exactly we're talking about. For example, there has been an announcement that Ethiopia is to gain 20 kilometers of sea coast or of coast on the Gulf of Aden for some kind of military facility. That's interesting, but one, we don't know where on the sea coast it is. We don't know. We know it's apparently 20 kilometers long. We have no idea how deep it is. Is it 1 kilometer deep? Is it 50 kilometers deep? I mean, there's a huge difference in terms of what kind of a base you're talking about, whether you're talking about 1 or 50. Admittedly, it's very significant that it's talked about at all. But it's that kind of detail that's just lacking. When the MOU was first announced, the Somaliland side was talking as though Ethiopia had already recognized the independence of Somaliland. The Ethiopian side said, "Oh, wait a minute, we're still discussing this." And I saw just for the first time today in the Addis Standard the apparent language out of the MOU, which says that the MOU includes provisions for the Ethiopian government to conduct an in-depth assessment towards taking a position regarding the efforts of Somaliland to gain international recognition. And that's a quotation, presumably, from the MOU. First time I've seen that. That's a very different statement than Somaliland announcing, well, Ethiopia has already agreed to recognize it. So it's just not that simple in terms of what is going on and what is going to be lived up to in terms of reality. And I would suggest that any idea that the government of Somalia is going to collaborate with Al-Shabaab to engage in some sort of action against Ethiopia is something that all of us need to rethink as to whether there's really any reality in that, because I suspect there is not.
Has there been any change in the international recognition of Somaliland since the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between Somaliland and Ethiopia? Specifically, are there additional countries that have recognized Somaliland as suggested by Mr. Redwan Hussein, the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia?
No, to the best of my knowledge, no country in the world has recognized Somaliland as an independent country, period, not since 1991 and up to the present day. Now, the only sort of relatively new development in all of this was in 2020, Taiwan agreed to establish a representative office in Hargeisa, which it has done. And there is, in fact, a representative office there. That is not an embassy. That is not official recognition. Somaliland has in turn established a representative office or a liaison office in Taiwan, in Taipei. So there is that relatively new development. But beyond that, nothing has changed. And in fact, both the United States and China, and perhaps others, have restated their position that they recognize the territorial integrity of Somalia, and that they are not at the point where they are recognizing Somaliland as an independent state. And it's possible that other countries have restated that position too, but the only two that I have seen are the United States and China.
What's the way forward? The Somaliland has been a de facto state for almost 32 years. And what's the way forward with that country, with that region? What do you see in the future? Do you think they will get their independence, or they will just stay as a de facto state?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's an issue that I have followed since 1991, and I still don't have a good answer to the question. I would say this on behalf of Somaliland: they can make a very strong legal case for independence. They were, in fact, an independent state for 5 days back in 1960, from I think June 26 of 1960 until July 1, when they joined Mogadishu as a unified state of the Somali Republic. But during that 4 or 5 day period of time, they were an independent state, and they can go back to that time frame and make the argument that they want to return to it. So from a strictly legal point of view, Somaliland has a pretty strong case to make. From a practical standpoint, you run into some issues, not the least of which is that there has been no support for the independence of Somaliland from the African Union. And I think the United States, among other countries, is very reluctant to take any position that would recognize Somaliland unless it were first acknowledged or approved by the African Union, which doesn't seem inclined to do that. There are some other practical issues in terms of the boundary or border issues between Puntland and Somaliland, and who actually controls some of that border area that would come back into play if there were serious moves to recognize the independence of Somaliland by other countries. So for the moment, everything is still on hold and nothing has changed. And I don't see the likelihood in the short term of anything changing unless Ethiopia does officially recognize Somaliland. And then that could open the door for others to do so. That would be a huge change, but that hasn't happened yet.
Can that lead to the independence of Somaliland if Ethiopia recognizes Somaliland?
Well, it would simply be then the first country to officially accept the diplomatic recognition of Somaliland. And once you have one country sort of breaking the mold, as it were, then there are some other countries in Africa that are sympathetic towards Somaliland and have toyed with the idea of recognizing it, but I think have basically not wanted to violate the authority of the African Union or the majority opinion in the African Union, and have not done so. But if Ethiopia were to do so, that does open the door for the possibility of others. And then if you get 5 or 6 African countries that do so, you might very well get other countries outside of Africa who would join in.
I just want to let you know that most of these questions are coming from my viewers, our viewers. So elites are asking, why hasn't the global community, particularly the United States, acting against Isaias of Eritrea and Abiy Ahmed, considering the belief among many scholars that they are causing disruption in the Red Sea and the broader Horn of Africa?
Well, I think there is a a realization in many quarters, particularly in the West and Western countries, the European Union and the United States, that Eritrea has not been playing a helpful role in the Horn of Africa. There clearly were concerns and publicly expressed concerns when Eritrean forces went into Tigray during the conflict between Tigray and the federal government. But that was done with the authorization of the Abiy Ahmed government at the time. So you can't blame that entirely upon Eritrea. If the government in Addis Ababa says, y'all come in and help us out, which they were more than happy to do because they wanted to eliminate the TPLF from Ethiopia. And they almost did that at one point. Now you have a situation where I think there's buyer's remorse in Addis Ababa, having invited them in. They're wondering what have they gotten out of that. In fact, there are some who suggest they have not entirely, the Eritreans have not completely left Tigray. I don't know what's happening on the ground, whether there are still Eritreans inside Tigray or not. There may very well be. But the point is that the view of Eritrea in Addis Ababa has shifted enormously in the last year, and to some extent, that's the fault of Addis Ababa to begin with. I mean, you can't say y'all come in and then say, well, now we don't like what you're doing, so y'all have to leave. It's a little harder to make this work. But as far as the Western countries are concerned, or the United States is concerned, there has been deep concern about the role of Eritrea in the region for quite some time. And that's why relations between the US and Eritrea are poor and have been poor pretty much throughout the 21st century, almost from the beginning. And they have not improved. But it also means that countries like the US have almost no leverage in Eritrea. We have no assistance programs there anymore. We have a small embassy, which sometimes has an ambassador in it and sometimes does not. We don't have much at all by way of foreign investment. I'm not sure we have anything left in terms of foreign investment there. There may be a few things. But the relationship is just about as low as it can be. And once you reach that point, you also do not have leverage. So even if the United States wanted to do more, and we have levied some sanctions on Eritrea, fairly modest sanctions, there's not an awful lot the United States can do.
This is just a scenario, Ambassador Shinn. Would it be legal for Biden administration to invite the Canadian government and attack California?
For the Biden government to invite
the Biden administration to invite Canadian government to help him attack the state of California.
Well, let me put it this way.
That's exactly what happened to Ethiopia. So would it be legal for Abiy Ahmed or Isaias Afwerki to be invited to attack Tigray? Would that be legal?
Yeah, I don't know about the legality of it. Technically, there's a possibility it might be legal, but it sure would be stupid. And I think that's the more important thing. Why would you do something so stupid? And legally, I'm not sure. I'm not an international lawyer, so I'm not sure how that would play out. But if it were to happen, it would probably be the end of the Biden administration.
That's what most Ethiopians feel. Even though Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed invited the Eritrean government to attack Tigray, and who has done all kinds of war crimes and atrocities. Again, many viewers ask that why does the United States, historically known for taking actions against dictators and war criminals like Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, and Gaddafi, appear less vigilant against notorious war criminals in the Horn of Africa?
Well, first off, you're implying that foreign policy is consistent among nations, and unfortunately, it's not always consistent. And that also applies to the United States. We have historically, we have actually supported some dictators, particularly in Latin America, in decades gone by. So I don't have a good answer to the question. I mean, we make the United States makes foreign policy decisions based on the situation existing at the time. Many of these decisions are transactional. They're based on taking into account other things that are going on around the world at the same time, what your priorities are, what you have sort of time to invest in, and put resources in. And sometimes you come up with decisions that look rather strange when compared against a similar decision in another part of the world. And that's just the way foreign policy is. I don't have a better answer than that.
I understand that part. Why, despite collaborative efforts by TPLF forces in areas like disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration DDR, has there been a delay in implementing crucial aspects of the Pretoria Agreement signed over a year ago? The unsolved issues include the withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara troops, accountability for atrocities, and the return of millions of IDPs to their villages, the release of detained Tigrayan members of ENDF, and the resumption of humanitarian aid delivery. What factors contribute to the failure in implementing the key elements of the Pretoria Agreement?
Well, I think the Pretoria Agreement is experiencing the same problem that so many of these peace agreements around the world face. They're relatively easy to negotiate and sign. They're exceedingly difficult to implement. And when I first saw the Pretoria Agreement and saw the terms that were involved there, I sort of shook my head and said, this is never going to happen according to the schedule laid out in the agreement. It's impossible. Why does anyone think that they can accomplish these goals in the time frame that was proposed in the Pretoria Agreement? And in fact, it's even been more difficult than I thought it would be. But this is pretty typical of peace agreements around the world. In fact, many of them just utterly fail, completely fail, and the parties go back to war. At a minimum, that has not happened. The guns have been silenced, and that's a very good thing. And that does at least allow for the possibility of implementing at some point in time the other pieces of the agreement. But the answer is this is a very hard thing to do, particularly the whole question of IDPs. You have to get agreement, you have to get understanding from the folks who have moved in to these areas that were previously occupied by Tigrayans, that they're willing peacefully to move out. And they're not going to do that willingly. And they may never be willing to do that. So we'll have to wait and see. You have to make the best possible effort to get agreement on what happens to the details of these agreements. And I think there is an effort to make a best faith effort. It's been further complicated by ongoing conflict particularly in Amhara region now. Which I'm sure is distracting the government in Addis Ababa, even though things are relatively quiet in Tigray. They're not quiet in other parts of Ethiopia. And as far as getting Eritreans out of Tigray, I don't know which one, I don't know how many are left or where they are, but getting them out is clearly not the priority of Addis Ababa at the moment. It may not even have the capacity for getting them out at the moment. So all of these things are, assuming they ever succeed, and there's some question that some of them may not be implemented, but if they do succeed, it's just going to take more time.
most of Ethiopians are curious as to how long is the US likely to continue its support for Abiy Ahmed's government, given the concerns about political and economic instability, as well as the absence of peace in various parts of Ethiopia?
I can't put a time frame on it, but the way the United States operates in these situations, and particularly with a country like Ethiopia, where we have a long and very important relationship. There are some countries around the world where the relationship is not long and it's frankly not very important. And as a result, not much attention is paid to it. That's not the case with Ethiopia. A lot of attention is paid to that relationship. And it's been a difficult relationship in the last several years. The U.S. effort, I think, has been to try to maintain a reasonably good relationship with Ethiopia, while at the same time putting on some pressure to obtain changes in areas where the United States would like to see changes. So for that reason, you have not yet had the reinstitution of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act for the government of Ethiopia. It still remains off the table. I think there's ongoing discussion as to whether Ethiopia ought to be given the right to use the AGOA effort, but so far the decision has been made to just leave it in abeyance. That's an effort at using what leverage the United States has in terms of improving Ethiopia's policies on issues that are important to the United States. And there are other areas too that the United States is, I'm sure, particularly behind the scenes, putting some pressure on Ethiopia to get policy improvement. Since I'm not part of those negotiations, I don't know the details of it, obviously, but I'm sure the way the U.S. government works, these efforts are ongoing, but at the same time, not wanting to break the relationship with Abiy Ahmed, who is, after all, the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. And so long as he is holding that position, he's the guy you work with. That's just a fact of life. Whether it's a situation that you're real happy about or not is not the issue. It's a fact.
Tigrayans are also curious, and other nations and nationalities are curious, why doesn't the global community, particularly the United States, encourage Tigrayans, seen by many researchers as having a decisive role in the Horn of Africa, to contribute to peace and stability in the region?
I guess I would have thought that the international community and the United States is making an effort to encourage Tigrayans to the extent that there is contact with Tigrayans, and presumably most of that has to take place in locations like Mekelle now. I don't know how many Tigrayans you find in Addis Ababa any longer, or at least Tigrayans in places of authority. But I would assume that is part of the effort of certainly the Western international community, and perhaps even other elements of the international community, like China or India. Or if you're suggesting that the international community is not doing that, I'm a little surprised, because I'm assuming that they are doing that.
This is also another question. I have many questions from viewers. So, friend asking, instead of targeting corrupt government officials with diplomatic sanctions, travel visa denials, and financial restrictions, the United States and UN Food Aid Program chose to suspend food aid to Tigray, citing corruption concerns. Does this decision, which exposes the victims to famine and starvation, align with a logical approach?
Well, first on the ending, and I can only speak for the United States, and I can't even do that with the authority of, since I'm not part of the U.S. government anymore. But I can speak to that issue, just understanding how U.S. policy works. My understanding is that the U.S. decision was to restrict humanitarian assistance throughout the entire country, not just Tigray. Now, as it happens, most of that assistance was going into Tigray. So they were impacted, the Tigrayans were impacted more than any other part of the country. But the Amhara region was impacted also. There was a fair amount of assistance going into to Amhara region when that decision was made. And it was made because there I understand, were some very serious concerns about misallocation of the food that was being distributed in various parts of Ethiopia, not just Tigray. And the only way that the United States felt it could get the attention of the authorities in Addis Ababa, Mekelle, Amhara region, anywhere else where these misallocations or misallotments were going on, was to stop the shipment of the food for a period of time, which the United States and the United Nations did. The UN resumed the shipments before the US resumed its side. But my understanding is that both the US and the UN have now resumed the shipments. I don't know how efficiently they are being delivered at the moment, but at least the supply has been resumed, and presumably there is an improvement in the situation on the ground.
I just want to play this so that to see how impactful is this. Ambassador Shinn, this is what exactly looks like in Tigray. I mean, the starved people should not pay the price for the corruption and stealing of food products. But again, what avenues exist for individuals or groups to influence a reconsideration of this decision and ensure the resumption of food aid to the famine-stricken areas of Tigray?
Well, first, I think that video clip was a fair description of what has taken place in Tigray. I think they did a good job in that video. They pointed out that much of the problem was due to a combination of failed rains, the civil conflict, which displaced huge numbers of Tigrayans. And as everyone knows, when you have displacement off your land for an extended period of time, you're not farming, you're not growing anything, your cattle are dying. It's going to be a catastrophic situation, which it was or is. So all the reasons were there for having this catastrophe. It's also true that it was exacerbated by the decision of the UN and the United States to at least temporarily interrupt the availability of food. But for the reason that was laid out in the video clip, there was corruption going on, there was misallocation of food, and for better or worse, and one can debate the decision was made. The only way to get the attention of everyone was to stop the delivery, and that will cause people to end the corruption. The international community is now trying to make up lost ground. The international aid organizations are back on the ground. Their NGOs, American and otherwise, are back in the region. I think they're all doing the best they can to avoid an all-out famine in Tigray region, and hopefully they will be successful in doing so. But it is a Herculean task, and there may be people who end up dying as a result of all of these missteps over the last couple of years, which is really unfortunate. But I think that the effort now by the international community is to do whatever it can to try to alleviate the situation and make life better for the people there. But it's not going to be easy, and particularly when, as we were talking earlier, there is not agreement on returning to original farms or homes for some of these people. Until there can be some political settlement, you probably are not going to have a complete solution to the problem, but you certainly can make it much better. And with a little bit of luck, maybe the rains will return and and farmers can grow more or they can do more on their own, but no one is able to control that.
Many Tigrayans also contemplate that do Tigrayans have grounds to hold global donor agencies such as USAID and WFP equally responsible as the Ethiopian government for the challenge they face, considering the collaboration of these food programs with the current regime in Ethiopia?
Well, that might be the tendency, just as a result of human nature, to always want to blame someone else for one's problems. And I suspect there's an element of that going on. The fact is that it's the Western community that is trying to step in to make things better for these people. I don't see North Korea doing this. I don't see Russia doing it. I don't see China doing it. But I do see the European countries, the United States and Canada and a few others doing it. And
but the United States is a champion of humanitarian democracy and rule of law. I mean, you don't expect anything from North Korea or Russia or other, nations, but you expect a lot from United States because the United States has a history of helping and giving a chance to humanity.
That's correct. More is expected of the United States and the Western countries in general than is expected of other countries. In my own view, I'm not sure why the other countries get a free pass on this. In my view, more should be expected of them too. And I get a little cranky sometimes when we don't expect anything of China or Russia or North Korea, but we do expect it of the Europeans and the United States. But the point is that the Western countries are stepping in now, belatedly, and trying to help out. And I think they will save a lot of lives as a result of that effort. The decision to interrupt food delivery more than a year ago, was that the right one? Well, that's debatable. And there are Americans who debate that also. There was not unanimity in the United States on that agreement, on that decision. But that was the decision, and it apparently achieved the desired result of ending the misallocation of food, which it was trying to do. Should the food have been reinstated earlier? Probably. And you probably would have fewer cases of famine and even possible death, and perhaps are being experienced now. But it is what it is, and all we can do now is make the best of a difficult situation.
Some scholars also ask, why doesn't President Biden pursue a similar humanitarian intervention as President Reagan did during the 1984 famine to save millions of Tigrayans, considering the current dire situation that could lead to the potential eradication of millions of women, children, and the elderly, if not addressed promptly. What is your future prospect of the famine in the Tigray, and what urgent measures can be taken to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe?
I don't know the volume of food going into Ethiopia as a country or Tigray as a region at the moment. I'm under the impression it's quite substantial, but I don't know the numbers. It's probably not of the same magnitude as you were referring to back in the 1980s, in that the famine back in the 1980s, and at that time I was serving in Sudan next door and dealing with Ethiopian refugees who were coming across the border into Sudan. But it was enormous. It covered a huge expanse of the country. So it was probably a more widespread famine than what you're likely to see in Ethiopia today. And in fact, my understanding is parts of Ethiopia are actually getting fairly good rains, which means you're presumably getting fairly good crops in some parts of the country. But can one do more? Sure, one can always do more. And I will be surprised if the United States does not stand up and, as usual, provide the most food that goes into Ethiopia, including Tigray, as it has done in the past, putting aside the interruption that we've already talked about. But I think the United States is prepared to do that. It's when it comes to humanitarian assistance, it's always been the first with the most, and there's just no one else out there that can compare to what the United States has done, not just in Ethiopia, but in other countries around the world.
Only have one question left, but I would like to play a clip.
Kissinger, a commanding figure under two presidents, Gerald Ford and Richard Nixon. What made him the figure that people know and remember today?
You know, like his mentor, Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger has an enormous but extremely mixed legacy. On the one hand, he gets a lot of credit for working with President Nixon to open up mainland China, communist China, and reorder fundamentally international relations in the Far East and beyond. He worked with President Nixon to achieve a détente in the early and mid 1970s and negotiate the first most critical arms control treaties with the Soviet Union, as well as working on the Helsinki. On the other hand, he has been involved in some of the most reprehensible policies on the part of the United States. The assassination of the president of Chile, Allende, and the support for a brutal, murderous dictatorial regime, the extending needlessly of the Vietnam War, falsely claiming in 1972 that peace was at hand, supporting a murderous dictatorship in Pakistan, as well as other dictators around the world. So, you know, I have to fundamentally disagree with Secretary Blinken. He is not the standard that we should follow. Yes, we should follow the best of Henry Kissinger, but we should avoid the worst of Henry Kissinger, not to mention as well his support for the horrible, destructive, illicit, secret bombing of Cambodia.
Well, that's what made his Nobel Peace Prize so controversial.
Yes, I think it was controversial and most uncalled for. You know, he has too much blood on his hands to be a Nobel laureate when it comes to peace.
Ambassador David Shinn, you may have worked with the most controversial diplomat in our history, Dr. Kissinger. He passed away around a month ago, or a little bit more than a month ago. He said he actually opposed Antony Blinken as a Secretary of State. This is not a standard. Mr. Secretary is not that vigilant like Kissinger. What's your comment? What Kissinger said on Secretary Antony Blinken, and also how do you describe his legacy?
Now, let me just focus on his legacy rather than his comments specifically about Blinken. First, I agree that he has a very mixed legacy. There are very important good elements to what he did, but as was pointed out, there are a number of bad ones. He has a very long legacy in U.S. foreign policy, even as an informal advisor after he left government. I tend to be an admirer of Kissinger in overall terms. He was a very intelligent individual. He certainly understood foreign policy. I mean, a true intellectual, but he had his blind sides. Now, I've always looked at Henry Kissinger from the standpoint of African affairs. My entire career, almost entire career, has been involved in Africa. So as a result, I did not have contact with Henry Kissinger, even though I was in the Department of State during the time that he was Secretary of State and he was head of the National Security Council. But the reason I didn't have contact with him, one, I was more junior, but two, I was dealing with Africa, and he didn't really have any interest in Africa, except for some of the Cold War implications of it, particularly Soviet and Cuban involvement in Angola and to some extent in Ethiopia, particularly in Angola. And he got quite involved in that. But beyond that, I would be hard pressed to name any African issue that he took an interest in during the time that I was in the Department of State. And I was there until the year 2000. So I outdate him in terms of longevity in foreign affairs, albeit at a far more junior level. So my criticism of Kissinger from the African perspective is he didn't take much interest in it. And I thought that was a mistake. And to the extent he did take an interest, it was pretty much limited to very significant Cold War elements. So although as I say, I do have a great admiration for him because of his, the fact that he is an intellectual, he is brilliant. He did do make some very important decisions in U.S. foreign policy. But there are downsides to his leadership also.
Oh, that is amazing. He's widely known, and he was very, very strong diplomat. One more thing, former President Trump is winning big, especially in Iowa. Do you think he will be the next president of the United States?
He'll certainly be the Republican nominee for president. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I'd be a little careful how I place my bets. I think you might lose a lot of money.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Shinn. We always appreciate your reflection and coming to comment about the Horn of Africa, the entire globe. And I hope to see you again in the near future. And thank you so much for your contribution today.
You're welcome, and have a happy New Year.
Thank you. The same to you.